Thanks for joining us for another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, and I'm here at the News Forum, where all voices matter. Maybe you've never heard of the term snow washing, but the effects of illicit financial transactions in Canada affects your taxes, your services, and ultimately your economic well-being. And it's a problem that government needs to get a handle on quickly, especially in the wake of the publication of the Pandora Papers, telling of secret bank accounts, money laundering, and tax evasion around the world. We're pleased to discuss this issue with James Cohen. He is the Executive Director of Transparency International Canada and an expert on anti-corruption. Welcome to the program, James.
Thank you for having me today, Tony.
I guess the first thing, maybe again, give your views generally on this issue of snow washing, including your definition of it. I did say something off the top of the show, but you're the expert, not I. So give us your sense of what's going on in Canada and why it's a problem.
Sure. Well, as you said, this week we had the release of the Pandora Papers. And this is roughly 5 years since we had the release of the Panama Papers, which really was the first big data dump of these kind of illicit financial flows around the world. And it really shone a light for all the public to see about how do not just the rich, but nefarious actors like kleptocrats or sanction busters or fraudsters, how do they move their money and hide their money around the world? And within the Panama Papers, whenever Canadian journalists looked at the revelations there and looked at the Canadian angle, a Toronto lawyer came up with the term snow washing. And this basically means that Canada is a great spot for people to stash their money according to the intermediaries that help out these nefarious actors for kind of two big reasons. One, when you think of money laundering, you typically think of, say, a tropical island or European Alps. You don't think of Canada. So first of all, who's really looking here? And our deterrence and our inspections over the years kind of shows that. But two, and importantly, we don't have the right laws in place in Canada. We have a lot of loopholes that allow people to use different legal vehicles to hide their identity. So back in the Panama Papers, Mossack Fonseca, the law firm in the center of it, them and people like them were marketing Canada to their clientele as basically bring your dirty money to Canada and it will be cleaned like the pure white snow, hence snow washing.
So I guess the obvious next question is, what's the extent of these illicit financial transactions in Canada?
Well, it's tough to peg an exact number, naturally, because corruption and money laundering, its whole goal is to not be detected and reported on its amounts. But we've seen estimates anywhere from $40 to $100 billion over the last decade of funds going through Canada. We've seen different kinds of measurements, things like the RCMP a couple of years ago in a report saying that 70% of cases go through anonymous ownership of property. Another study coming out by the government of British Columbia, one that they commissioned, found that money laundering impacts housing prices by 5 to 7% on average. So there are different metrics about the scale and the impact that we're seeing. Globally, it's been estimated that roughly $11 trillion is hid offshore and away from inspection and from tax authorities and from law enforcement.
You mentioned real estate. Obviously, that's a concern to a lot of people these days with the high prices. So is that one of the impacts, that there's a lot of demand seeking little supply, including this illicit demand?
Yeah, I would never say that money laundering is the reason for housing prices to go up, but it's certainly the most nefarious reason. So I cited that report that came out from an expert panel from the government of British Columbia. So there is a measurable impact, and not just on the price, but on supply. So with the limited amount of supply and condos going up, I mean, anecdotally, people see it walking around Vancouver, walking around Toronto, these condos with no lights on in the evening. And these are just safety deposit boxes for some of the worst actors around the world to stash their money.
And here we are in Canada, and we're sort of paying the price literally as well in terms of housing costs and inflation and so on. We're going to continue our discussion with James Cohen. He is the Executive Director of Transparency International Canada. We're talking about snow washing, basically illicit transactions that are happening in Canada and around the world. A very interesting topic. We'll continue to delve into it after the break. Please stay with us. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. I'm here with James Cohen. He is the Executive Director of Transparency International Canada. James, you mentioned before the break how Canada is a magnet for a number of reasons. Obviously, it's maybe the place that people don't ordinarily think of because we've got a shortage of palm trees in this country. I don't know if you've noticed that. But, at the same time, I guess this is also an issue of enforcement, right? You said that we don't have the appropriate laws in place. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Right. So Canada's anti-money laundering laws are governed. We have a national regulation on that, and a gap that's been identified by advocates in Canada and by the Financial Action Task Force, which is a global standard-setting body on anti-money laundering, found that we don't have any kind of centralized place to identify who the true owners are behind shell companies or the ultimate beneficial owner. So you can have owning the condo, you have company 123. That company is then owned by ABC. That company is owned by QW, whatever. And behind all that is Bob. Who is Bob and where did Bob get his money from? Not to implicate any Bobs here.
Yeah, sure.
But it makes it even worse when company ABC is then offshores and so on and so forth. So law enforcement has a difficult time accessing who that information or who the true beneficial ownership is. And up until very recently, it was left to our financial institutions to conduct the due diligence around that. Thankfully, we have seen some movement over the years. Now, agencies known as enablers, or in the more technical term, designated non-financial businesses and professions, like accountants, real estate agents, luxury good dealers, they now have to also conduct that kind of due diligence on beneficial owners. So we're seeing some progress, but at the end of the day, there needs to be a collected place for that information. And we at Transparency International Canada and other advocates have been calling for a pan-Canadian publicly accessible registry of beneficial ownership to make it easy for law enforcement and all these reporting entities, as well as journalists and civil society, to dig through this information and also deter people who would want to play our system.
Now, are there other countries that already have these remedies in place?
Yeah, there are. So the United Kingdom was the first country to put in such a registry. They're not the gold standard with it. They're very much a guinea pig, they would even admit. So there's problems with data verification. For example, when it says, what's your nationality? People will type in UK, U.K. English, Cornish, which is a territory in England. So there's work to be done, and Canada can learn from that. The European Union, all of its members are meant to have a publicly accessible registry. They've done it to varying degrees. And people say that's great that the UK has a registry, but if their offshore jurisdictions like Jersey, like BVI, don't have one, what's the big deal?
Right.
What impact are we making? But thankfully, those offshore jurisdictions have committed to registries by 2025. And then we even saw the United States pass legislation at the beginning of this year that they will have to have a registry. So there is global momentum towards this standard.
Now, I guess I just want to draw a distinction, get your commentary on it, because it's not illegal to place your money in the British Virgin Islands, for example.
Yeah, exactly. It is not illegal to have a numbered company, to have it offshore.
Right.
The problem is that this system is so opaque and so abused that there needs to be changes to the system. We can't just rely on the goodwill or the limited resources that law enforcement have, and then they keep hitting a wall. So again, not illegal, but a highly abused system.
Right. So the issue is, to want to pay lower taxes is not in and of itself illegal, but when you're talking about money laundering, for example, that's obviously something that we've all got to be concerned about.
Yeah, and we've seen that in the discussion this week around the Pandora Papers, tax avoidance versus tax evasion. And, it's a really kind of skirting line that avoidance is the authorities know that you reduced your tax amount, maybe even aggressively or not in the spirit of the laws, they might say. And that's a whole other discussion about loopholes on taxes. But that same system, if you've got loose enough morals and good enough enablers who are willing to look the other way, you can go from avoidance to evasion. And even within that, as you said, there's money laundering, which is flat out illegal for kleptocrats, sanctions busters, and fraudsters.
We're going to continue our discussion after the break with James Cohen. He is the Executive Director of Transparency International Canada. We'll be right back after this break. Stay with us. And we're back here at Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with James Cohen. He is the Executive Director of Transparency International Canada. James, just want to delve a little bit more into enforcement. Obviously, the RCMP, I'm presuming, is our major enforcement agency when it comes to this. Tell me if I'm wrong on that. Do they have adequate resources to do this job?
You have a couple of different units looking at it in different ways. So the Canada Revenue Agency, the RCMP, and our Financial Intelligence Unit, FinTrack. And we even have anti-money laundering investigators at different subunits of the RCMP and provincial municipal jurisdictions like the OPP. And generally, no. Coming out of the Pandora Papers, we've seen comments from the Public Service Union saying that they don't have the resources to go after this. There was a quote by a former head of money laundering unit in the RCMP, following up on the Pandora Papers, saying that it's the best time ever to be conducting money laundering in this country, and that not enough resources are placed on this. So this isn't just the advocates talking that there's not enough resources. This is the people charged with conducting investigations and oversight, saying they don't have the means and there's not enough political will currently looking at this.
And just by saying the way you said it with the RCMP, you've got the OPP, you've got all these different central agencies and other agencies, it sounds like there could be an issue about the level of cooperation. Is that one of the challenges?
There are definitely jurisdictional issues in Canada. And so even when we look at trying to unmask who's behind shell companies, this is why we say we need a pan-Canadian registry, because the changes would happen in the corporate registries. And we have 14 corporate registries in Canada. So it can't just be the federal government making the changes. It has to be everyone doing it together. Otherwise, I don't want to name a province specifically, but one could hold out, not make any changes, and become the Switzerland of Canada. Right. And the RCMP, it's a thing you don't think about, but when it was explained to me that the RCMP even has to pay to conduct searches in corporate registries within Canada to conduct searches, that's another resource wall that I hadn't even thought of. They should have direct access to this information.
So in terms of what Transparency International Canada is doing, you must have then a list of remedies or things you want changed. Maybe just go through that again a little bit.
Yeah, and I kind of asterisk everything I'm recommending was saying there's no silver bullet to fighting corruption and money laundering. It's a number of tools, it's a number of efforts, but there are a couple of key tools. One, as I said, is the publicly accessible registry. There's been evidence that it can be a deterrent effect. In the UK, we've seen it act as a deterrent to people abusing limited partnerships there. And so we need that in Canada. We were really happy to see it announced in the federal budget this year. We already saw the changes to our federal anti-money laundering laws that designated non-financial businesses and professions now have to conduct beneficial ownership due diligence. So those are two big ones. There's the land ownership registry in BC, and there's rumors of other provinces wanting to establish those. Those are good tools. But there needs to be other kind of structural adjustments, say in law enforcement, to get the right kind of capacities in place. It takes years to build up expertise in anti-money laundering. We lost a lot of those people a couple of years ago, about a decade ago, when our anti-corruption unit was disbanded. We need to get those people back in and give them the motivation, give them the resources to be able to conduct very complex, very time-intensive investigations involving terabytes of data. So there's a lot of steps towards this.
Is that part of the issue, that this has become a data-driven exercise? It's not like, getting Al Capone and saying you've been a tax evader. It's masses of data, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very complicated. We're talking about masses of data, multiple jurisdictions that have different rules and need to cooperate together. So even when we say something like offshore, it's a little bit of a dated term, because you think of, say, again, the islands or Europe. What we have to do is look at this as a global network, of which Canada is a hub, and we have multiple networks. And in order to address a network, you need cooperation together, and you need to raise standards across the board.
We're going to continue with that topic. I do want to ask you about more international cooperation, but we are going to take one more break before we finish up with our guest, Mr. James Cohen. He is the Executive Director of Transparency International Canada, and we're talking about the Pandora Papers and more generally illicit transactions in Canada and elsewhere. Stay with us. And welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum. We're here with James Cohen. He is the Executive Director of Transparency International Canada. James, before the break, we are, again, just talking a little bit about what should be done in Canada, but you made the point that international cooperation is very important too, because these are very complex transactions with layers and layers of data and shell companies in different parts of the world. So how can we get more international cooperation, do you think?
Well, one, Canada has to walk the walk before we lecture anyone else on what to do. And so thankfully, we are making the changes. Again, the global standard setting body, the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF, has been going through some amendments on these changes. And right now, they are actually deliberating whether all of their over 100 members should, as a standard, have these beneficial ownership registries. So with Canada announcing that we will have one, we can then put pressure on the FATF and other members to adopt these, because critics might say, well, that's fine that FATF members have it. What eventually people might just put their dirty money in, China or Russia. But the fact of the matter is that's where dirty money is coming from, and people don't want to put their money into a jurisdiction where authorities will just arbitrarily take it. They want a rule of law jurisdiction. So these FATF standards help. Establishing greater mutual legal assistance helps. Having better coordinated illicit financial flow bodies and money laundering intelligence bodies also helps these standards. So there's quite a bit of things we can do on cooperation.
Yeah, it sounds like in order for these registries to really work, it really has to be a global approach, right? There can't be areas of leakage where people can stash their money. Is that ultimately that's the gold standard, right?
Yeah, that's the standard we're going for, and we are seeing momentum in that direction. There's a number of different global networks, the Open Government Partnership, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, that are all pushing their members to adopt this standard of beneficial ownership to end the abuse of shell companies. So we've seen it starting since the Panama Papers. Things like the Pandora Papers kind of raise up the standard and the pressure, saying, have we changed things yet? And so hopefully we will see changes to continue globally along this line.
Do you foresee a day when this will be a problem of the past, that we can have an approach where these kinds of illicit transactions are gone, or is it where, like when we had the nuclear arms race, where governments come up with issues, they come up with plans, and then the bad guys come up with more sophisticated arrangements? Is this a problem?
Yeah, you're dealing with people who want to move and hide and be able to use their dirty money. So the crooks are always going to look for a new way. But the global illicit financial flow system put together by shell companies, we at least need to dismantle that. We can't just say the crooks are going to try something else, so why bother? So the hope is that this really does cut off a number of their avenues, and hopefully we catch some of them and discourage, the enablers that allow this system from wanting to participate further. Because the crooks alone don't do this. There's very well-paid intermediaries who allow them to do this so that they can help perpetuate conflict, income inequality around the world, and some of our worst environmental catastrophes.
We've got less than 30 seconds left, and I apologize if this is a whole other can of worms, but what about crypto?
Crypto is a whole other can of worms. I have to admit, I am not an expert on crypto. I do know that it is being discussed within regulatory frameworks about how does it fit in and how can we have reliable currency exchanges that do conduct customer due diligence. So I think that's definitely an area that we have to keep our eye on within this frame.
Well, James, thanks for your insights. We'll get a crypto expert on to answer my question at a later time, but thanks for being on my show.
Thanks. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Well, there you have it with the release of the Pandora Papers. Obviously, this is not a new phenomenon of these hiding these illicit transactions around the world, and certainly the Pandora Papers debate has shone light on it yet again. But there are things that Canada could do and should do, and ultimately has to do if we're going to get a handle on this. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for watching.